Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night to all of you, and thank you for joining us for our 3-hour intensive on advocacy. As we gather during the 16 days of activism, we pause to recognize that there are many spaces where the voices of others have been muted. And this is why we gather, because as people of faith, we invite members of faith-based communities, churches, etc., to think about how we can make a difference in the lives of those who have been placed on the margins based on the fact that we have voice, we have agency in different spaces in our context, even in our worship spaces. And so we invite you to join with us on this journey of discovery, on this journey of conversationality, on this journey of advocacy. At this time, the senior leadership of the WCC are out at the executive committee meetings, but with us is one of our directors, particularly our Director for Climate Justice and Sustainable Development, Athena Peralta, and she will bring you greetings on behalf of the World Council of Churches and also invite you to think a little bit about advocacy. Please note that when you are invited to join the breakout rooms, you may need to do so yourself because the turnout has been exceptionally large, and so we were unable to place you in the breakout rooms as intended. So please go with your first choice, and we look forward to hearing from you and teaching you from our spaces of knowledge in a moment. Athena, welcome.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and also good morning, at least from my part of the world. On behalf of the World Council of Churches, it is really such a pleasure to welcome you to this online advocacy training program. Churches have very important pastoral and diaconal responsibilities, but ours also is the critical task of bearing witness and speaking truth to power from the perspective of the disempowered, from the perspective of the marginalized, of those who are living in the socioeconomic margins of our world. The World Council of Churches has always seen advocacy as an important part of churches' engagement in the world since its formation more than 70 years ago, and in particular contributing to the development of the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Such engagement has become even more important in a time of global climate change, which, as everyone knows, is already exerting tremendous suffering in many parts of the world, but especially on income poor and climate vulnerable nations, and on women, on children, on youth, and on indigenous peoples. The World Council of Churches has closely followed the UN climate conferences from the very beginning. And indeed, we were at the recently concluded COP29 that was held in Baku. Sisters and brothers, at the heart of our advocacy work is the understanding that justice is at the core of the divine plan for people and planet. And through this training program, we hope that we learn deeply from each other on how to better advocate for a fairer and also a more sustainable planet. Again, a big warm welcome to all of you who have joined us, and also a very, very big thank you in advance to our contributors for offering their time, their wisdom, and their experience. And we very much look forward to this enriching training, no doubt, an enriching training. So thank you very much again to everyone. And thank you, Nikki. Back to you.
Thank you so very much, Athena. Friends, Siblings, it is an absolute joy to have you here gathered with us. And so we invite you to pause for a moment as we go to God in prayer. Loving God, we come to you this morning with your divine mandate to recognize that we have been made in your image, crafted in your likeness. We pray even now that you would guide us in our deliberations, in our learnings, that we would be open to hearing from you, open to framing the work and witness of your people, the church. Might we speak as you have invited us to speak, and as Athena reminded us, may we speak truth to power in all spaces, in all spheres of life. Be with us even now, we pray. Cover the speakers, the facilitators, cover us, the participants, and may we leave here feeling enriched, and more so, being ready and able to communicate with others about the blessing we have had in this training, to speak for others and being the voice of the oppressed. This is the prayer of our hearts. In the name of Yeshua, Amen. We have a fairly compact program for you today. We should be starting in another minute or five with an introduction to advocacy with Lani Anaya. We will have a time of question and answer. We move then into breakout sessions where you are invited to participate in the electives for advocacy through preaching. How do I ensure that the spoken word from the pulpit or even in smaller group gatherings makes a difference for those with whom we communicate? How do we ensure that just the words of thus saith the Lord accompanies the need to speak for those whose voices have been silenced? The other option is for worship formation. As we prepare what looks like a liturgical frame, how do we ensure that issues that are critical and current and contextual are reflected even in the songs, the scripture we use, the prayers we pray? How do we make this all come together? And that will be led for us by Reverend Dr. Grace Moon. Then the other option is Bible study. And Padre James Bagwan will be guiding us on this. Siblings, I invite us to think, to join in, to speak up, and to speak out. After our breakout sessions, we reconvene on issue-specific advocacy. People with disabilities, people with the desire to overcome racism, discrimination, xenophobia, and any other form of ism that we often face. We then have the opportunity for Q&A and we close. Thus, I invite us to prepare for the breakout rooms, but in the interim, let us pause as we welcome Lani Anaya to speak with us. Lani, welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Not hearing you so well.
Okay, let me.
And we're not seeing you. Walter, can you spotlight her? Or is it Gloria?
Yes, I'm waiting for her to be ready, and now she should be.
Okay. She's been having some internet issues, so I'm praying that it will work.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nikki, and thanks for the prayer. I'm really happy to be with you all. I am reading you're coming from different places, and it's just an honor to share this introduction with you. More than a presentation, I wanted this to be more like a dialogue because, well, I will be providing a bit of my background and how Patricia and I were sharing. Patricia from the Caribbean and I were thinking about how to make this introduction more interactive. one of the things we have thought about is, well, I see, as I said, I see you come from different places, but if I have to question you on the chat, can you tell me what is the main problematic thing? Like, what is the main challenge you would like to do advocacy for in your churches or in your faith-based organization, so we can get to know a bit of that. So if you can place that on the chat, that would be really nice. And as I said, I'm gonna give a bit of my background. I did my bachelor in international relations, but I have been involved with the church for many years now, especially during my young uh, period. Part of the advocacy I began was outside the church with young people, and I still continue with that, with gender questions. And now I am, well, I grew up in the Methodist Church. I'm still part of the member of the Methodist Church still, but now I'm also part of the Lutheran Church. Um, in Mexico, I was part of the Methodist Church, and in Sweden, I'm part of the Lutheran Church, and I work for ACT Church of Sweden, which is the international department of the Lutheran Church in our country. So that said, what I have seen as an academic working for international relations and doing advocacy, both in within local levels, but also at the UN level, is that it's very relevant, the work that churches have to do with advocacy. Um, Part of my research at some point was how churches get involved in advocacy, why are churches important in the dynamics, and something that churches provided any actor, not governments or not international organizations, can provide is that you in your churches know the dynamics of the everyday life. So as churches, we know who is who in our communities, who is playing what, how dynamics interact, what are the actors who hold power or not. You are there in the communities, so you are frontliners for any situations. We have seen that whenever conflicts are happening or disasters like hurricanes, the churches are there because that's one of the first level communities that people have in their everyday lives. So, so as you are there, that you have all the access to the dynamics, the actors, all the people in your communities, then that's the first line to do an advocacy. My second question would be for you. I see that you're writing your names, but as I said, if you can name here in the chat, what will be one of the main issues that you see being at the front line of your churches, being at your communities? What is the main challenges you see in your church that you would like to do advocacy for? Because I think that would be set a preamble for what can we do next. Um, we, Patricia and I also talk. Patricia will be at 4 in the seminar at 4. But we also talk that advocacy is part of the calling of churches. So when we talk in the ecumenical movement, I remember my school lessons at Bose, we also mentioned that the prophetical voice we have as communities is not only talking about like the future, but also being a prophetic voice, announcing what are the injustices that we see in our churches. It can be migration, it can be, as I said, gender, it can be about conflict happening around us. So there are many things that the church has a calling to do advocacy for, and we are called to be also those voices who are talking for societies. And I think we can see that also in Jesus' example, how he was also standing with the poor, and how in many Bible verses we see that we have to announce the good news, but also to share with the poor, and in the especially in the gospel, we can look what that is part of our calling as churches. So now it's regardless you are a lay person or a pastor or someone involved in the church at some to some extent, we have that call to be advocates for justice in our world, not only in the future and not only the world we want to see later, but also in the world today. And thank you, Roxanne, for sharing. Yes, justice on racism, ethnic cleansing, genocide. and also, and I would like to insist again. I see many people on the call. I see 57 people on the call. But if you could talk about what is in your context, in your community, something you want to advocate for, we can. That's how can we also learn from each other. I would, for example, I would provide some concrete examples from the context in Mexico and Sweden. For example, in Mexico, something that is happening a lot right now, it's the issue of migration. We have many corridors from Honduras and Guatemala and Central America who are trying to reach the US. So some years ago, the church ministries in the Methodist Church were working with migration, and then we also were advocating with the governments. There's another project that I know in Mexico that it's about disappearances. I don't know how familiar you are with this situation in Mexico, but in Mexico, we are one of the countries with high levels of disappearances. That is for disappearances happening from the governments, but also from criminal organizations. So there is a group with the Methodist Church, the Catholic Church, and an ecumenical group called Iglesias por la Paz, Churches for Peace. And they not only they are accompanying as a church, as I said, knowing the dynamics in every local community, they accompany the people who are whose members are disappearing, but also they are praying together ecumenically, and they are also talking with the governments, especially with the ministry, our you could say like our government ministry, that would be like the first minister in some countries, the prime minister, to talk about how these appearances are affecting our communities, and especially now recently with WCC we released a statement with Padre Marcelo, who was a priest in the Catholic Church in Chiapas, and he was killed. He was murdered. He was threatened many times because he was defending the indigenous communities, and he passed away some weeks ago. So we connect. That's one way that in Mexico there's a connection between what is happening at the local level, but also taking these questions up to global levels, as with World Council of Churches, with the UN. That's the way we can do advocacy. I see also, Roxanne, thank you. You talk about poverty in my community. Marvin talks about xenophobia, racism, oppressive economic systems, involvement of interpretation, and sign languages, which is also very important to be more inclusive in our communities. Thank you also sharing from South Africa about poverty among the young people and economic and political inclusion. So we have all these challenges happening in our churches, happening close to us. And some guidance Patricia and I wanted to also provide to you was to start thinking. Like now we know there are these challenges. Maybe some of you have some experience in advocacy, but where do I start? And some ways to start doing advocacy is knowing the actors you have around you. So now I'm going to give some examples in Sweden, for instance. So, for example, here in Sweden, my husband is working with a migration issue. He's a priest in the church. So he works in the countryside, and he has been living that there is a community who came from many different countries, and the Swedish government took over together with the UN. But they're here in Sweden, they're also facing really difficult conditions. For example, here now it's winter, and some of these houses where they are staying, they have no heating. So it's very difficult for them to cook or to be warm in their places. So what the church has been doing with my husband and other people have been doing, has also been working with other organizations, not only the church, but they are working with the UN Foundation, Save the Children, and other organizations here in Sweden to provide some support to these organizations. So I think that would be a second question that I want to tell you on the screen. If you can now that you have I'm looking at the different problems or dynamics you would like to address in your local communities. What would be the actors? What kind of actors do you have beyond the church that you could start talking about? Because I think advocacy is kind of not only talking about the issue, but having an impact how do we make political decision making? So if you could think about these issues now, all the issues you have shared with me, who would be those actors that you think they are in your community that you can start talking with them, not only to announce or to share the problems that you are facing in your community, but also that you could do something with them. And think here about, it can be governments, it can be NGOs, it can be another church. What kind of actors would you have there? Can you write them there in the chat? Because it would be interesting to know who do I know that my church could work with, so we could have a plan. And I know that will be also we will talk about, as Nikki said, worship and Bible studies. But for advocacy, also it's good to know, like have a mapping, that we call that a mapping of actors. So who who would you think, like for example, here Georgia with the um, women's role in the church and populations affected by environmental crisis, who would you talk to if you had to begin doing advocacy, if you have to begin working on political decision making to address this issue? Who would you address? Um, what about yeah, thank you, Nikki. Picked, yeah, exactly. Actors are people who we work. As I said, it can be an NGO, it can be the community. Your even who do you have in your church? There might be persons who are already connected to the governments or to some um, instance that could help you with this issue. So as you were writing a lot of questions you want to address: creation care, trauma, mental health, spiritual healing, um, disabilities. So who do you have close to you? Can you write it on the chat so we can also explore what actors can we find? What kind of people we want to make a difference with, to look, to envision the change we want to see. As I said, think about your congregation, think about local governments, think about the UN bodies. Maybe you know some UN body in your country. Private sector can also be part of this. So who would you address here if you can write it on the chat, especially all of you who have written some issues. Um, Thank you, Nikki. Yeah, so Nikki's writing that she remembers once she was preaching about a change she wants to make, and there was a political leader sitting in the members of the congregation, and that's a way to initiate some advocacy, because then you are addressing the issue, you are announcing there is a problem to be solved, but also there is a connection there. Um, so I'm calling that Babihue, Daniel, Georgia, Rodia, Marvin. If you can write also, who would like to, who would you approach for these issues? Um, because I think that's one of the most important steps of advocacy. We're willing to announce that we want to make a change in our churches or in our communities. Then it's important that we know who are we talking with. Um, George, it depends on the power of the local churches. Sure, yes, and how open they are to collaborate. We should approach directly high-level religious leaders if we want to change advocacy work. Yes, and I think that's really important. If you have that access to high-level church leaders or religious leaders, then that you should approach them. And I'm gonna tell something that I'm used to tell to young people, because that's the main group I work with. Don't be afraid. Like, don't be afraid to write a letter. Don't be afraid to talk with some people, because sometimes that's also a fear we have when we want to do some advocacy. We are afraid that, well, they might say no, they might be not willing to help. But then if you the worst thing that can happen is that they will say no. But the most positive thing is that they might be willing to cooperate. So just don't be afraid look for it. That's also, I think that's part of the church's initiative and part of our personalities of initiative we have to get with this advocacy, to write an email, to go and approach the institutions we need to close. Yeah, we probably here I'm reading Marvin and also Roxanne. I think here Marvin. Yeah, Marvin, you're saying we might need a we might need a close relationship with political and economic players within our communities. We don't have that relationship, so we don't have any positive feedback from them at all. And then I will ask another question, Marvin. Is there any access to it? Is there any email? Is there any address you can approach them to, so you could get that close relationship? Um, Also, you and yeah, Roxanne, we have even a local office for refugees. Ewodia, the private sector want to invest in where you can measure impact. So writing down your journey is very important. Yes. And for this issue, Ewodia, I would like to share something very quick. There's something that I recommend also to my students. It's called elevator pitch. And I don't know if you are familiar with this, but this is a strategy we try to do when you want to promote something you are working on, like some activities, some projects you have in your communities. And it's elevator pitch. It's called elevator pitch because it has to be less than 3 minutes. Less than 3 minutes speech. Sometimes in the churches, when we do preaching and when we talk at churches, we tend to talk a lot. And we have a long speech. But for this, especially with private sector or other governments or UN offices, that would be something to address. The elevator pitch is it's divided in 3 stages. So first, you are the one who know the community. You are the ones, as I said, the local churches know the dynamics, know the problems. So the first stage of the pitch would be that I address the problem with some specific issue. Like, for example, if I'm going to talk about migration in Mexico, I would say, did you know that more than 8 million people were coming from Honduras and Guatemala through the border to get to the US because the conditions are very violent in Central America, in the Northern Triangle. So that would be my main issue, right? Then, if I am a church already working with the issue, then I have to tell this person, okay, my church for this problem, my church in Mexico, in Apasco, that's a community. We have a refugee base where we are feeding the people, we are providing some mental care issues, we are providing sanitary goods for the people who are coming through. And the last part is, where do you need the support with? So I would say, well, right now, where we need support is that you help us to talk with the government. If I'm talking with the UN, you can help us to talk with the government to remark that the situation is gonna be increasing now with the new government in the US. That's just to give an example. But then you have these 3 stages. So you have the issue, you mentioned the problem, one of the main issues for the problem, that it's very specific. Then the second part, you talk about what are you doing as a church? And the third, what do you need from this actor, from this person? And that should be 3 minutes only. So what you are going to do with this is you call the attention of the person you're talking with, and you also promote a step further. So that would be a very simple first step to do some advocacy with actors. And I say this again, it has to be really specific, consistent, and take it to the next level. So when you finish with this, what do I need? Then you can tell them, okay, it would be good if we can have a meeting to discuss this. Or here is my card, here is my number. I would like you to, we can talk later on this issue. So I think to approach as I'm and as I'm reading the examples, I think that is one way that we could do it. And I'm going to share a link on this elevator pitch so you can also have that as part of your tools. I think with traditional leadership, as here I see Ayaqua talking about traditional leadership, the church congregants, teachers, yes. And for those, you already have the pulpit there. So you can talk with them. You can be in the communities. That's how do we engage our community, our leadership, our congregants? I think that's a bit different from the pitch I gave, but it's more how do we engage them through preaching, through a Bible study, through worship, and you will see this in the further sessions. So do you, as a church together, can help in the front line. And then I see Reverend Delkey. We can build networking from the small communities, which is also good. Like I see this both in if you are a church, there might be other churches working or interested to invest time and resources and energy on the same challenge you're looking at, but also small communities because you are the ones knowing the community, as I said before. At the FOWOPE, I see you also wrote advocacy bodies of other church denominations. Yes, if we are an ecumenical institution, if we are working ecumenically, that means we can work with other churches. So if you see other church boards, other national boards working, the Catholic Church, other NGOs, for example, the Catholic Church has also Caritas or Catholic Relief. There are other if you want to work interreligiously, there's also, for example, Islamic Relief. So there are many organizations that you can also talk with. As I said, the example of migration here in Sweden, this is in a small community, but you have this UN Foundation and Save the Children. And the government, they have been talking with the governments as well, the local governments. So you have these networks you can work with, and it can be religious and non-religious. Gunilla, I see the question on how to involve actors also depend on the level of trust. Yes. Uh, and I think that's also something we as faith-based organizations and churches sometimes have those challenges that people are little, so in some contexts, I won't say that it's in every context, but in some contexts it can be that some actors are not are a bit skeptical of working with churches, right? They have this, they could have a narrative or a vision of church that it's different. They could be that it could be that your context, the churches are not sometimes well seen, or there is this separation between state and church that it's very clear, or in some cases also that people think that churches like nowadays we live a lot this that some groups think that churches are anti-rights, right? Like they have very different perspective about human rights. So that could be an issue. But I think that that's where also the pitch, this elevator pitch works a bit, because then you can have a first approach where you can present yourself. Knowing each other is part of building that trust, and you have to get to know those actors and they have to get to know you. That's it might take some, but I think it can be possible as you can set some dialogues and you can the first thing, as I said, to approach to share what's your interest, what's your narrative, and how do you want to address it together. But yeah, trust is very important. We at Roxanne, we also need to buy in the local churches we serve. Yes, because if yeah, that's also very important because if you are the only person driving this, one person cannot do it all. So you need support from your own congregation. You need support, and I think that's again what these tools we are learning in the further sessions about worship, about Bible study can be very useful. Because if your community, if your church is not convinced that this is an issue you have to work with, you will be alone. And I think a lot about the Ubuntu, uh, about Ubuntu. I am because we are. So if you are working alone, you can make some things, but you won't be making a whole change. So it's better when you have your own congregation working together, being aware that this is a thing as a church you have to address, something that you have to be calling to. And that's what we will learn in the further sessions. Yes, very important. I also read this, Ewodi, and thanks for reminding us. You have to get to know your congregations because in your congregation, you might have very interesting people that could be good for what you're thinking. Sometimes I agree with you, we are not appropriating the skills among our members. So we have a lot of skills in your congregations, and you can have many options to like many different gifts. We are churches. We believe in spiritual gifts. We believe that people have also gotten knowledge, and they have some gifts to get to provide and to help others. So if you as a leader, or you as a pastor or as a priest, you have to be aware who's in your community and what type of talents and gifts you have in your own community. Because you, as I said, you could have a person who works already for the government, or you could have a person who's really good with accountant, and you need also that for a project, right? Like, or nowadays that we do a lot of social media, how do we expose a problem, and how do we present this in a very friendly way? So you might have a young person there who's really good with TikTok, for example. So all these talents or these gifts have to be used, and we as a leaders of our communities, we have to get to know people, so you also know who could help you within your congregations. Um, and then yeah, move the traditional borders. Yes. Nowadays, I think part of this advocacy works, and that's I come from peace studies, but we have seen that when you are including not only the traditional leaders but also women, also young people, the likelihood that the change will be more sustainable is higher. So think about these communities, the communities that have been marginalized before, especially because of the kind of issues I'm looking at in this in the chat. You have to include these communities. We cannot work, for example, for migration or for disabilities if we don't include these communities, because we are not providing what they. We sometimes we think that we know what they need, but we have to include them as part of these actors, um, to really know what is the main need of this population. Um, so yeah, we have to go beyond the traditional ways. And I think well, here we need to change the mindset and mission and advocacy, that what means in our churches, and not only because we are yeah, our churches are very stuck in our traditions. So yes, part of doing this advocacy is going out. Like, we have to preach not only within the church, but we have to also preach it outside, and we have to change the way we do things. So this, I think, that's Nikki. That's well said. That's why we are here, and I think at least this the pitch, also the fact that we are sharing already some challenges in our churches and how can we work with them. That is very important. I know we have also a short time now, but something I also encourage you to do in your communities, it's a photo voice projects. I don't know if you have done that before, or if someone here is familiar with photo voice. Photo voice, that I I cannot see all the faces. So yes, okay, yeah, I see Georgia, I see Delki, yes. So what happens with photo voice projects, and I will share these links later on as well. It's a methodology used especially for the communities to start advocacy. So we ask the people, it can be any, what I like about this methodology is it can be any age, it can be any person. And we most of us now have a smartphone. So what we do with this methodology is that we ask the community to take pictures. On one side, they have to take one picture of what they really like about the community. So something that they are really proud about the community. So we start with the positive, and then we ask them also to share or to take a picture about what they would like to change. And that helps us to know how does the community see the challenges within the place they are living. So they take these two pictures, and later on we gather the group. So people share their pictures, and the community has to choose one picture, one challenge. So that's the challenge they will work with. But so this makes a very participatory approach where people can share both what they are proud, how they build an identity, positive identity about the community, but then with the pictures that are challenging, what kind of challenge can you work on together? And I think that is very useful, especially in communities like the churches, where you could decide also, okay, from all these challenges, we want to choose one, and then how do we approach this in a way? Um, I give this example because I did this in Brazil. Um, uh, I I I think we're not quiet. Yeah. Sorry, I am looking at the chat as well. But I think it might be your microphone, Gloria, because we are talking. Um, so so with this methodology, for example, I have this example from Brazil. I was working in Brazil for a while, and then in Brazil we did this methodology with young people, and they had different challenges. But one challenge they shared with us in a picture was they met this female who was living in Brazil in a small community, Vianópolis, and she was deaf, she couldn't speak, and she was living alone. So the young people decided that that was the person they wanted to help because they saw that it was challenging for her. She was in her elderly years, and what we did afterwards, we connected with a local radio station. So what we did was we shared this methodology on the radio, how the young people share the pictures, how did we arrive to the challenge we want to address, and it was amazing that while we were sharing this in the local radio station, we got people providing food, coming to the station, providing food for this lady. The small businesses, for example, construction business, came with materials to help with the house. And that was a very small effort, but we did a lot with a photo voice project. There was more than 100 people in the community came to the radio station to give something. And if this can happen in the radio station in a local community, I think that can happen in our churches too. So I think that is a good methodology we can apply in our churches to start with advocacy. Um, uh, so I think we will open now for questions because I know we have a short time before we start with the workshops. But I hope these tools and I hope this purpose of why advocacy is important have been helpful, and I'm happy to connect with you. I will write my contact information on the chat, and thank you very much for this. Nikki, I don't hear you. Maybe it's my.
We can't hear you clearly, Nikki.
I think if you would agree, Lonnie, I mean, what we're doing is we're asking participants to ask any questions. Maybe
Yes.
they can ask them in the chat and you can respond while Nikki works on her sound.
Okay, nice. Yeah. So yes, we can open the floor for questions if there is any question. I will write I will share an article about photo voice and about elevator pitch. But yeah, you can, if anyone has a question, you can either raise your hand or you can write it on the chat. So feel free to do so. So there I'm sharing the photo voice, one article about photo voice.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, Lani, I was suggesting that you could speak for another 5 minutes because we do have time for Q&A
Okay.
in the program. So there's a 10-minute Q&A, but keep going.
Okay. So I'm just keep sharing. Yeah, I start sharing about photo voice. Um, I'm think, and I'm gonna share a video about how to create an elevator pitch. But yeah, so I think before we move on to the Q&A, I think the important issue here for the introduction, as I said, is that you have mapped your own problem. The main challenge, we have a lot of challenges in our churches, so we cannot solve everything. That we would love to do that, but we cannot do that. And I tend to tell to both with the young people I work with, but also doing the I'm project manager for the Church of Sweden for Central America. So we tend to ask people to be very specific. What kind of from all the challenges you see, what is the main challenge you want to address? And the second step is what are the how are you going to do that, and what actors do you need for your advocacy plan? So that's also very important. I think also we have to make use about especially now that we are in the call, I think we have to make use of these connections. A lot of the work that is happening is locally, but then the advocacy sometimes has to be international. We have these situations, for example, with sexual and reproductive rights in Honduras now, and that's an example from my organization with our Church of Sweden. There is a very challenging situation for pastors who are supporting this, and they are facing threats, really violent threats. What we do as our Church of Sweden is that we also advocate here at the parliament, the Swedish parliament. So that's a way, like we map these actors, the Swedish parliamentarians. So we talk with them. We have brought persons from Honduras here, and so they can share directly their experiences. And then the parliamentarians, the Swedish parliamentarians have written letters to the president of Honduras about the situation. So it's also how do we connect those different levels um, to accompany each other. I think we have to be careful, though. International actors don't solve the crisis at the local. For me, the local, we are going into in a decolonizing approach and localizing approach. It's important that you in the local community have the voice, but it's also good that you have the international accompaniment. And I think that's part of the advocacy strategies we can use. So we have to make use about, for example, the World Council of Churches. They have relationship with the Human Rights High Commission. That is an option that we have to explore more. We have this connection with SCSW, the Commission the Commission Status of Women, for example. There is we were like last September, I was in New York and I met people from World Council of Churches and other churches at the Summit of the Future. So there are these connections we already have at the international level, but they shouldn't be the voices. It has to be you. So you have to fight for your space there. And I say this also working at the international level. It's the local narrative that we want to address. So you as a local narrative, you can use these channels, but it has to be you. And yeah, and I see Nikki laughing, but I think it's very important that you, as being at the local level, you being aware of that dynamic, are the ones having the voice and the space in those places. And the international community, these spaces we have with World Council of Churches, the UN, and so on, there are the spaces, the channels you can use, but you have to be the voice.
I like that response, Lani, because we are trying so much to change this concept of the voice for the voiceless. Everyone has a voice. And so it is that we are amplifying the voice of those who have been silenced or muted. So at the local level, you can say, it's like the Billy Goat's Grove. You remember that story? Some of you don't know it. Well, in the Billy Goat's Grove, there were three goats trying to cross for grass that was greener on the other side. What they didn't realize was that there was a troll living under the bridge. Every time the little goat was to go over, the troll says, I'm gonna eat you. And the little goat says, Hold on. I have a bigger brother. Talk to him. and the medium-sized goat came, the troll says, I'm gonna eat you both. And the medium-sized goat says, hold on, I have a brother. And he goes for the big billy goat gruff. And when troll comes for the big billy goat gruff, there is a medium, there is baby goat gruff walking behind him, and the troll was ready to eat all of them. And big billy goat gruff just pushed the troll out of the way, and they solved the problem. Now,
We cannot hear you, Nikki. Again. There. No.
Nope, your sound cut off. Nikki, no sound again. Lonnie, maybe you could address, there was a question about, is there an easy way to measure impact? And I think that's an important issue in advocacy.
Yes. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I think there are some ways to measure, and I have some manuals that we could share with you while we are here. And yeah, I hope that yeah, we can hear Nikki later on. But there is a manual with M&E, so it's important, for example, to set goals. As you are working on an advocacy strategy, who do you want to reach? What kind of change do you want to make? So I'm tracing back to the example I was giving about what our Church of Sweden is doing with Honduras. So we have an advocacy person, Sana, and she has been working with this. So for us, the most important for this advocacy strategy with these religious leaders and non-religious leaders working with sexual violence and sexual rights it was more like the product we want to achieve from this. So for us, it was important to set a goal in terms of having a product from the government who could that we could share internationally. So that is, for example, for me, an indicator of like not we didn't know it was going to be a letter from the parliamentarians, but we at least we were expecting that it would be like a statement or some communication. So that is something we can measure with some indicators, some products, some outputs there. Another way to measure is how many people you are reaching. So that's also important. But I think that is that depends also a lot. It can be that you impact a lot of people within your church, but then for the advocacy to make a change in decision making, that wouldn't be that number would not tell you that much. But I have a manual here. I will share that with you about how can you also look at the strategies and features of evaluation that can be useful for you, because yeah. Some things that are important is yeah, how are you making the impact? What are the type of products, advocacy products you are obtaining from it? How do you know, for example, also that could be some way to measure in a quick way. Are we, after doing these pitches, are we ensuring in our advocacy strategy that we are not alone as churches or as faith-based organizations to do the advocacy? And that could be like measuring how many actors are you working with for this strategy. So that's another very quick way to do this. But yeah, so in a quick way, it could be what kind of products do you want to obtain from your strategy? How many actors you want you to work with or engage in this advocacy strategy? What are what are the impacts in the sense of are we like especially for the monitoring and evaluation, are we actually making a change? For this example I'm providing, it was like this letter, because it was at the end it has been two letters we have written from the Swedish Parliament to the government in Honduras, and there has been at least some change. And so the laws that we were advocating for didn't pass through. There were other laws that at the end it was unavoidable to to pass, but at least those laws about the um, the pill, for example, a contraceptive, yeah, the about I have the term in Spanish only. So it was like, for example, medication, like to uh, um, prevent pregnancies before, especially during in cases of rape. So that was something we through the Swedish parliamentarians and the advocacy work we could do. So I think those are four ways to measure the products again, the products you are willing to produce, even you just exactly don't know which product, the actors that you are engaging with, the impact you're having with the society, and how do we what are the changes in especially in political decision making and law frameworks that you are obtaining from this.
I think the term you were looking for is the morning after pill
Yeah,
or the
thank
date
you.
rape pill.
Thanks.
Well, no, the date rape pill is the one they used to rape folk. The morning after pill is the one
Yeah, that one.
used
Yeah.
to prevent pregnancies after rape. So the question then is, who are the people in our neighborhood? Are they people with whom we are communicating? There is room for one more question, maybe even two, before we move to the rest of the conversation. Are there other questions? I see a new question has popped up in the chat. No, that's from you. What happens if I don't see change after I've done my advocacy in the big arena?
That's a good question. Then I think you have to re-strategize. I see that some things, some challenges I see now, that is part of the. I think it's important also to say that part of my background is now with the UN, doing advocacy with major groups, and you can join that group as well. NGO major group. We are more than 300 organizations. Something that I see nowadays is that it's very difficult within the civil society to strategize. That is a main challenge we have today. And that I think that's one of the main reasons why our strategies are not moving at the global level. So when we are having this kind of challenge, I think we have to go back, maybe a step back and see what is happening with our strategy. Because maybe the actors we were looking for are not the actors that we should approach, or they are not as invested as we are for these issues. Maybe our communication strategy is not good enough, so we have to make it better. Also, nowadays, and I know this is a very sensitive topic, but I think it's important to give to provide that example. But something that has been happening in our group is with the conflict in the Middle East. We have people who won't say anything because they have funding from governments that are having some positions. So that is limiting a lot how the civil society in that group is talking about the issue in the Middle East, right? So I think that's why it's very important to know what actors you have around, and also how like sometimes I think that civil society shouldn't be so dependent on some funding, because I know resources are limited, but also resources have some strings attached. And it's sorry for saying this, but that happens in the corporation. So that's something like if you have to really know your actors, as you said, there are issues of trust. You in the chat were writing about this, issues of trust, issues of alignment with goals. So if you know that you have to really know your actors and see whether they will be invested in the same issues that you're talking about. I'm not saying that one issue is better than other, or I'm not going to any direction on this, on the example I'm providing, but more about if you are aligned with the actor's perspective, that will be easier for you to accomplish an advocacy strategy. But if your strategy is not successful in that way, then you have to step back and look what is happening. Are you having the actors you need? Are you maybe also how do we communicate a problem is not the best way. So we have to learn about communication and advocacy. That's very important to do statements. Um, are we are we having an impact in my congregation, but maybe not outside the congregation? What is happening there? Are we uh, even cooperating among organizations is not easy. You have to negotiate. You have to talk together and to see what do you the commonalities you share about this issue. So I think there are many steps that might hinder or not the success on your advocacy, but you have to. That's why you have to be constantly measuring, monitoring the strategy and evaluating because it's good if it's not working, then it's good to change. That's not a problem. We can trace back. That's we shouldn't see this as a failure. I tend to see this more as lessons learned. We have to overcome
Yeah,
for the next strategy.
when page 44, I
Sorry about that. So I hear you inviting us to evaluate. So should I say then, Lani, that regardless of where we are in the advocacy process, whether it be an elevator pitch, preaching, Bible study, worship, at the end of it, we need to do some degree of evaluation to say what worked using that, what you call it, the thing, the photo, the
Before the voice.
photo voice. What works and what doesn't work. And
Mm,
then thinking, and what do I do to improve on the
mm.
next time around? Folks, Lani has shared so much with us. She has fed us, she has nourished us, and she has put us in first gear for what is to follow. We want to thank Lani for her knowledge. We want to thank Lani for her expertise. We want to thank Lani for her sharing of the different platforms with which we may get connected. Please, if you for 1 second have access to the chat, ensure that you capture the different tools that she has provided for us. Speaking of chat, in the chat presently, we will note that there is a listing of the groups for the different cohorts. There is preaching with Reverend James Bagwan from the Pacific. There is worship with Reverend Dr. Grace Moon from Asia. There is Bible study with Professor Dr. Rasko Jovic from Europe. How can we advocate in our church spaces? As church leaders, how do we mobilize the change that we need to see? Earlier, one of our colleagues in the chat said, you know, church people are so stuck in our ways and we don't enjoy embracing change, but they listen and we are called to help them to hear. So, thank you again, Lani. We invite you now to identify a breakout group that you would like to be part of. And in the next 4 to 5 minutes, we will open the breakout rooms for you to join. What I'm going to invite at this moment, before we go into our breakout rooms, is to have Reverend Bagwan, Reverend Dr. Moon, and Professor Yolvik in less than a minute to tell us what are we going to be hearing in this space. In less than a minute, what is it that we will hear? For those of you wondering how you get there, you will be taken to a room shortly. Reverend Bagwan, are you still with us? What are you going to be sharing with us in your session? In less than a minute, what will you be sharing? I'm not hearing Reverend Bagwan. Reverend Dr. Moon, are you here? Can you in 1 minute tell us what it is that we are going to be
I think we
hearing?
were already sent to our rooms. We've just come back again.
Oh,
Um, so yeah, Bulavinaka, warm Pacific greetings, everyone. We're going to talk about speaking the word of God in the different spaces that we need to speak and have the prophetic, pastoral, and practical voices heard. And I'll just be sharing from how we do advocacy in the Pacific way. Thank you.
thank you. Reverend Moon.
Yeah, in the worship formation session, we are going to rethink about what is worship and what worship or what elements should be included in our worship to advocate the issues in our communities, and how do we make the faith of formation through our worship. That's the frame of our session. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Yovik.
I hope you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yes, hopefully, we're gonna pick up something from the Bible and try to inspire people and to show how sometimes things maybe we see them differently than what they are and what they present. And what they present is usually something that invites us to change our attitudes and our worldviews in our society today. I hope that's going to be interesting for some people.
Thank you so much. So, folk, at this time, we invite you to choose a room or to go to the room to which you have been assigned, and we will see you back in a few minutes. Thank you. Thank you all. I am not sure about you, but I'm telling you, I started in the worship session and that was powerful. And Reverend Dr. Grace led us through some conversation. And then I realized that all was well there. And I sat in the preaching session and I was back in seminary. I was learning how to do the prayer sermon, how to do the elevator pitch, how to read an audience. I mean, there was just so much rich information. Professor Rasco, because I was recording for the preaching, I was not able to join the Bible study group, but knowing your expertise and how you have delivered in the past, I am sure that it was an engaging session. Padre, Reverend Dr. Grace, Professor Dr. Rasco, I want to thank you all for making the effort to help us to understand that wherever we are spaces of advocacy. Before we go into our breakout sessions, before we go into our issue-specific advocacy, I wonder whether there is any particular question that someone is burning up with and wishes to raise at this time. You are welcome to put that one burning question in the chat, and then we will move into our issue-specific advocacy with Angie on people with disabilities. We will be making the PowerPoint presentations available. Yes, thank you. And we will collect them from the presenters, facilitators, and share them with you at a later point. Yes. I don't think I'm seeing any other question. And so we have heard how to preach. We have heard how to teach. We have heard how to prepare our Bible studies to amplify issues. But some of us would argue, I'm still not 100% sure, though I noted that in each of those settings, our facilitators were very clear on identifying an issue, following through on where Lani took us, to say, here are some issues, and these were how we handled them in specific cases. But so often we leave out some other issues, some key issues, and we want to start then with inviting conversation, advocacy for people with disabilities. I welcome and I invite you in the chat or with your cameras on to welcome Anggiasari Ariati from the Indonesian islands. Yes, and Roxanne says worship was excellent too. I was there for the 2 minutes, so yes, it was excellent. Angie, over to you.
Hi everyone. Perhaps a bit of introduction from me. I'm Anggi. I'm from Indonesia. Lives in Bali, and have been working for advocacy for persons with disability, particularly women with disabilities in Indonesia for the past 11 years. Starting from the faith-based organizations and now moving forward into national and international advocacy. Um, I was contacted by Reverend Nicole through Angeline uh, to introduce the issues, the importance in advocacy for persons with disability, and what does it mean to be a person with disability. I would like to make my points. Let me see if I can share my points. Image from no, not image from hold on. Let's do one. So document. Yeah, hold on. Doesn't. All right. Well, I'm going to send you the documents later after the talk. I have 15 minutes. So when we're talking about women, persons with disabilities, particularly women with disabilities, we are talking about layers of barriers. Identity of persons with disability. We are um, intersectionality, intersection. We are everywhere. We are, but nowhere to be seen as well. In Indonesia, particularly when we talk about the presence of persons with disabilities in public schools, it's less than 1%. I was speaking at universities, at campuses, and during the introduction of what the issues of disabilities, I asked to the students, have you had classmates of persons with disability during your elementary, during your junior high school, and even high school? And less than 1%. And perhaps there are very, very rare occasions that are two or three people amongst 30, two or three students amongst 30 students that raised their hands and said, yes, I had once friends during my elementary or during junior high that they are persons with disabilities. And this is a bit concerning because according to the global data, it is at least 15 to 16% of persons with disabilities is living among us. And so, what does it mean to be persons with disabilities in a society where ableism, male-dominated culture is strong? There is a need of advocacy in a softer way. If we experience advocacy, the image of an advocate is probably very vocal, very vocal persons, a very with strong principles. With you can see the image of what is an advocate for specific issues. There is a bit of air of uh, difference from other people. But in terms of a society where ableism and male-dominated culture is very strong, we need a more persuasive actions. Or perhaps in our in terms of our experience would be contextualized how to advocate for persons with disability. Um, there is a several division of how to bring up issues of disability, because to open conversation about disability, it means we also have to look in the church, for example, we need to look on their interpretation of what is disability, how God sees disability, how Jesus treats disability, how we can reinterpret all those interpretation that we knew from our from our childhood. How do we open compassion and rights based to be aligned together to promote a fulfilling life in God's love? And so when we talk about when we started open conversation about disability, we also need to look on our congregations, um, whether there is a person with disability or there is none. Because I believe if the global data says at least 15%, at least, because we know that data usually have larger numbers that is not collected. Um, we we can roughly assume that there are certain people with disabilities is hidden in the from because of their family still feels a disgrace, feels that it is the fruit of sin, perhaps it is a curse of the family, and so they are hidden inside, not inside their house. And even more, they are sometimes being um, in their room for the whole of their life. They cannot even go outside from their room because of the embarrassment, because of the disgrace that the family is suffering for having a person with disability among them. Whether it is their children, whether it is their relatives, whether it is their one of the family member. And so what do I mean with persuasive action is that I'm very impressed with the preaching session that Reverend Bagwan was highlighting about uh, the importance of knowing your audience, the importance of knowing the context of where you are, who do you talk to, or whether do you do the homework of identifying your congregations. It is very important that we know exactly who is our congregation, who is those people who is still have the perception that disability is sin, disability is a curse, disability is a disgrace, and this conversation is comes from compassion. It is not come from judgment. It is not come from what you do is wrong. You cannot hide your family member, but coming from compassion that, hey, I know what you're going through, touching all those uh, um, um, primary issues of humanity. What what is their fear of not acknowledging or not bringing up their family member who lives with disability? What is their main um, issues of it? Is it abandonment? Is it ignorance? Is it financial situation? Because there's a lot of motives beside of curse, embarrassment, uh, to be able to identify and touching all those issues, what are their fear, what are their security and insecurity, and how we can bring this up into a more compassionate way, that understanding these issues, and also then bringing up the conversation of why it is important to bring your family member who lives with disability into the society. I think based on my experience with the community that I have been involved and also advocating for myself, is that sometimes people don't see me as a person with disability. So I live with the condition of achondroplasia, which means limiting my mobility, and also there is still stigma in the community, that persons with living with achondroplasia, or perhaps the familiar terms would be a little person, they have this magical spiritual magical power, and also, but sometimes as a spiritual being, in quote unquote, that is in a negative context as well. And so living with these situations, enforcing myself to adapt to the society, to be able to um, to advocate myself that I need accessibility. I need reasonable accommodation to be able to move in the society freely, to be able to participate in the society, to be able to attend the church, for example, to attend the sermon, to be able to participate as part of the perhaps the elderly of the churches, because as a persons with disabilities, or in my position as a little people, particularly, and women who lives independently, uh, it is very rare for this kind of situations, for me to be able to participate at church as elderly, for example, uh, to um, to influence people who make decisions at church, to engage the discussion of what it means to be a person with disabilities, living in a society, religious society. And so when Lani is speaking about how we should start the discussion of um, see what's the tradition, the church tradition um, that we can adapt, that we can contextualize into a more inclusive environment for persons with disabilities. Because I think it is very important that because the number of persons with disabilities in the world is not going to be less and less and less, and I think it's even going to be more. It's time, each year it's going to be more, because we see lots of conflict, we see lots of international conflicts now. We experience a disaster um, due to the living in hazardous environment. During the climate change that is happening, there's a lot of instability in terms of national security, in terms of where we live as well, particularly me living in the islands, close to the beach, and that we see flood is coming every year, and they took even greater than the last time. And so people with disabilities who lives in this kind of condition is very much vulnerable, twice as much or even thrice as much than regular people. They're non-disabled people, because the their vulnerability, their dependence on their supporting system is a lot more than non-disabled people. Without the presence of churches to become one of the supporting system can that can promote and empower persons with disabilities to achieve their potential life, to achieve their potential ability, that the best that they can, or helping families who have persons with disabilities living among them. um, People with disabilities would be left with no support at all. And this is we can see this happening when we talk about disaster, there are numbers of cases where persons with disability is left because they were taking a lot more effort to be saved from their house, or the family just forgot about them because they left persons with disabilities inside of their room for so many years. They often forgotten, and when this disaster happened, when the family has been rescued, they escape from the danger of the situation, and those persons with disability who is locked in their room, they cannot go anywhere, and so they have become victims, and even their casualties is not being um, properly marked into the data because the family just doesn't recognize them. They were not put into the civil into the ID card, the national ID card. They don't even have that. Those people who lives in remote areas, those people who are and even people with disabilities as indigenous people, layers of barriers that is uh, faced by people with disabilities in across the world, in everywhere. We are everywhere, but also we are nowhere to be seen. Living with disability for me means understanding the grace of God from that other perspective. Because the narrative, I'm very I'm interested with Reverend Bagwanda said, uh, sorry, Lani said that the narrative of people with disabilities is not being talked about a lot. The thing is, the church has those communities from local to global. The church has the local narratives, but also the church have the global narrative to be able to talk about these vulnerable communities, these vulnerable populations, because the church have the population. The church have women. The church have children. The church have elderly. The church also have people with disabilities, and those people with disabilities lives and longing to be able to participate at the church traditions, not only as just a person who sit inside of the church, but people with disabilities who longs to be able to participate in the church tradition as well. And living with disability means experiencing difference, uh, enriching life. Living with people with disability means we understand a lot more what the society needs, how we can improve life, the quality life of the society. There is always this understanding that I always try to convey to politician to the community, is that when we talk about disability, when we drafted programs about people with disabilities, we know that that these programs, that this policy that we drafted for people with disability will also benefit non-disabled people, because we think about people who is the most vulnerable first. When we think about the people who lives in the most vulnerable situation, people with disabilities who live in the most lack of access, we will think ways of how these situations will improve the society. We see we see now a lot of public places have installed ramps, have installed accessible toilets for people with disabilities that they can use, not only for people with disabilities but children, mothers who have small children, elderly people also benefit from that situation. When we thought about these populations first, when we drafting our programs, when um, we making our decisions, we know that these decisions will not only benefit people with disabilities, but will benefit community at large. It is happening, and I think when we talk about more making the church more inclusive for people with disabilities, we can see that the community itself will make a better a better position in viewing in and in receiving people with disabilities, because in places like um most of Asian countries, for example, my country, Indonesia, where our experience is heavily um, influenced by our religious perspective. When religious communities accept and welcome persons with disabilities in their church, in their religious communities, the public would accept more the change, and less resistance. Um, this is a very this is a very hopeful situation if the church everywhere starting this conversation. And I think what is happening at the moment is that for my experience working with lots of communities, both religious communities and also public at large, national wide, the conversation of engaging more and more persons with disabilities, and also increasing the capacity of persons with disabilities, should be able to um, to reach people in remote areas as well.
Thank you.
And
And
yes,
Guy, I'm
yeah.
gonna ask you to give us your last two thoughts in a minute because we're now over time. So,
Okay, sorry.
thoughts you would like to leave with us in a minute.
Yes. So thank you, Nikki. This is a very precious opportunities for me to talk about my passion as well. Is that the church has so many potential in including persons with disabilities, um, in engaging them within the liturgy, opening discussion on the points of biblical studies, and mainstreaming disabilities issues in terms of the preaching, and then the diaconic program, and lots of more that the church has potential to be able to create inclusive communities.
Thank you so very much. So, Angie is
Yes.
advocating that we have inclusive communities, and that is the perfect point in which to invite Dr. Masiwa Rajesh Gunda to speak to us about overcoming racism, xenophobia, and other discriminations. Masiwa, welcome. Can you share a bit with us about using tools of advocacy to overcome racism? Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, sisters and brothers. So I will try in the next few minutes to highlight some of the key issues that we possibly have to think about and to think around as we continue to develop our advocacy skills. And the starting point, I would take you back to 1975 at the Fifth Assembly of the World Council of Churches in Nairobi, in Kenya. During this assembly, following years of conversations among Christian churches, members of the World Council of Churches, and their partners, they came up with what they called in 1975 a fundamental conviction, which says racism is a sin against God and against fellow human beings. And this has been since then the undergirding principle to the work that we do, which classifies racism as sinful. And as Christians, this is particularly important. And racism in many other countries has also been made illegal, one way, sometimes directly, but in some instances indirectly via a number of laws that are put in place in various countries. And it is on this basis that as churches, as faith communities, we begin to think of advocating. The reason being, even though it is sinful, racism is still rearing its ugly head in our faith communities. It is still present in our wider societies. And so, for that reason, there is need to stand up, to speak with, to speak for the people that are actually experiencing racism in our different contexts. But in the work of the World Council of Churches, we do not only advocate racism or advocate for racial justice, we are also focusing on xenophobia, which is also closely related to racism. We also advocate with and for communities that are discriminated on work, on descent, on ethnicity, all kinds of discriminations that are in a way related to racism. So just briefly, racism would be referring to the unfair, illegal, and sinful treatment of people based on their ethnicity, skin color, type of hair, religious affiliation, culture, language, and so on. So we have that. But the most popular of these elements or aspects of racism has been skin color or colorism. When I was growing up and I never understood it, it used to be called the color bar. That was racism. So people graded on the basis of color from black or darkest to the lightest, in which the lightest was obviously what was aspired to, what was perfect, while the darkest or black was then considered as vile, evil, and whatever else, but also beneath everything else. Connected to this is the unfair, illegal, and sinful treatment of people based on their nationality, based on their ethnicity, language, religion, culture, citizenship. But color does not play a significant role in this second type of discrimination, which is xenophobia. So xenophobia sometimes occurs between people that, in terms of skin color, might be in the same category. Either we all have a lot of melanin in our system, or we are all light skinned, or we are brown and whatever, but we are still finding other bases upon which we look down upon on each other. And then we have various other discrimination, like the caste system in South Asia, in which people are discriminated. We know of the experiences of Dalit people, but we also know of the experiences of Roma people across Europe, and we know of other communities in Latin America, the Quilombola, we have the Haratina in Africa, and so on, communities that are discriminated on work and descent. And these attitudes, these discriminatory attitudes, occur at both interpersonal as well as systemic levels. And that means, as we have been thinking of advocacy and discussing advocacy, our advocacy must always be conscious of addressing the interpersonal as well as the systemic. So whatever it is that we are doing to speak with, to speak for, and to stand up and to stand with. We are always conscious that there are instances when we must stand with and stand for in addressing interpersonal instances, the daily experiences of individuals. I am a Zimbabwean living in Geneva. There are a lot of things that happen on a daily basis. When you are walking down the street, when you are going into a supermarket, you do encounter cases of interpersonal racial injustice, prejudices, and so on. But there are also systemic. These are instances where racism is embedded in our laws, it is embedded in our policies, it is embedded in the professional, so to speak, professional in quotes, professional practices where people think they are just implementing or enforcing the law when in actual fact they are also embracing and entrenching racial prejudice. So I will focus on the areas when we are advocating both interpersonal and systemic racism. What are the areas? I don't know if I can share so we have, I will quickly try to put this in place. This is the kind of image that came up in my mind when I was thinking of the intersection of racism and the areas in which racism emerges in our different communities. And as you can see, it is complicated because it is almost everywhere. And so our advocacy sometimes is not really directed only at racism. It is directed at racism as it manifests itself in different areas in our communities. Earlier, my colleague Athena spoke about climate injustice, and I was listening to Reverend James earlier speaking about the experiences in the Pacific. But we all know that the climate injustice and the climate induced crises that the world is experiencing are also being worsened, especially when it comes to the risk and vulnerability of communities that are racialized. Communities that are Black, communities that are indigenous, communities that are not necessarily classified as white. So the climate experience, while we are constantly informed that climate is affecting everyone globally, when we advocate for and with people that are living with racial prejudice and systemic racism every single day, the level of vulnerability increases. When an island full of Black people is sinking, the world is indifferent. When an island full of indigenous people is sinking, the world is indifferent. But sometimes when an island full of white people is sinking, the world acts. When conflict broke out in Ukraine, the reaction was different from when conflict broke out in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Yemen, and so on, because of racial prejudice and systemic racism. Disaster responses. When our communities go through disasters, it is always important to remember those people that are marginalized in our communities. It could be racism, it could be xenophobia, it could be casteism. we need to always be mindful of the vulnerability of the marginalized, because in disaster situations, that vulnerability is increased. Economic, climate, and conflict-induced migration is another area in which we could do advocacy for racial justice, or for justice around foreigners, migrants. Inequalities in economic privileges are areas where we need to always be mindful of. Health, gender injustice, education is another area, humanitarian and development responses and aid. These are all areas in which racial justice advocacy can take place. Advocacy with and for migrants can take place in all these various areas. It is therefore important that we understand the context in which racial justice advocacy has to take place. It is in these different areas. And when these combine in different communities, the situation of racialized communities becomes much, much worse. And you can imagine when those racialized communities are also women and they are also persons living with disability, in which you are now seeing an intersection of disability, gender, and racial identity all coming together to create insurmountable obstacles for the realization of the full potential of the persons that we work with. And so our advocacy normally is targeted. And these things have already been highlighted, so I will not belabor this point. But it is very important when we are doing advocacy to know what the targets of our advocacy are. And I think it is very critical, particularly when it comes to member churches or churches in general, or faith communities in general. We reach the areas that most other institutions in our societies do not reach. We live and are the grassroots. So it is always very important that we have a target of the grassroots. If the grassroots is active and conscious, it makes life easier in terms of advocacy. While advocacy is really targeted at people that we think are strategic and critical, it is the numbers that can be mobilized at the grassroots that are of critical importance. So how do we bring our advocacy message to the grassroots? How do we make this the language of the people? As I was thinking earlier, I thought, how about having a very simple message, a world and a word without racism or xenophobia? If this is the message, how do we make this the language of the people at the grassroots? How do we make this the daily conversation point? Because with the grassroots now buying into this language, our next target is to look at the law and policy makers. Racism is not simply an attitude in an individual. It is that, but it is more. Racism is embedded in our laws. It is embedded in our policies. It is even embedded in our books. We have racism in many places, some places where some of us do not even imagine. Our hymn books are also littered with racism. Our prayer books are also littered with racism and xenophobia. So how do we begin? Who are these people that are responsible for making these resources? We need to target them with our advocacy work. But we know that sometimes some people make these resources, but other people actually implement them. So as we are developing, how do we begin to target as well the implementers? For when we have targeted the grassroots, the lawmakers, and the implementers, we get very close to achieving the just community that we all aspire to. And finally, I would say, in terms of how, develop a simple message. I think, and this has been said already, a simple message that can stick in people's mind. I have gone to places where people have said to me, oh, Thursdays in Black. It's 3 words, but it's so powerful and it's so simple that minds can easily master this. So, what is our message? If it is about all being children of God, because we are believers, if it is a world without racism, and so on. But we need to have a real message. The next thing, I think, in terms of the conceptualization of an advocacy work, is also to do a mapping of the skill set in our communities. An earlier presenter has already indicated. In churches, we have all the skill set because all these people who are professionals in so many different areas still come and sit in our pews. And some of them want to serve, but they are never invited to serve because we think, what can we use their skill set in the life of the church? If we are going to be successful advocates, it is important to understand what skill sets we have within our community. What is our approach? We want to mainstream racial justice language. We want to mainstream xenophobic free language. We want also to be the bridge between those that are suffering, those that are experiencing racism and discrimination, and those that can actually change the environment. So as churches mainly, we are looking at mainstreaming ourselves, our own language, our own pulpits, all the spaces, the funerals, the weddings, all these are spaces in which anti-racist messages can be mainstream. But we also play the role of bridging between the victims and the perpetrators, but also in terms of the lawmakers and implementers. And so the methods, as already indicated, Bible studies are a powerful method of addressing, of mainstreaming and bridging. Sermons can do the same. But also as churches, we need to actively participate in the public hearings that are done in our communities with our national leaders, with local leaders. These are spaces where we go in to speak with and to stand with those that are victims of racism, of xenophobia, of other forms of discrimination. So it is important that as churches, we continue to be grounded in scripture, we continue to uphold the traditional methods that we have been using to reach out to people, but we can do this also ideally by really targeting, mainstreaming our messages and making ourselves the bridge between the victims, the lawmakers and implementers, as well as the perpetrators. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Masiwa. In the chat, I see You're asking whether there are prototypes or case studies where what we're talking about have been approached in real life situations. How would you like to respond to that question?
Do I go ahead? Okay, so as the World Council of Churches, you might know that we are not always, so we are not in the grassroots, even though we are in the grassroots. So we are in the grassroots through our member churches, but we are not in the grassroots because we are a secretariat based in Geneva with a few other staff in some places around the world. What we have done, particularly on racial justice, is to focus on the United Nations, for example. So the United Nations has various mechanisms for racial justice. There is the intergovernmental bodies, the ICED, but there is the working group of experts on people of African descent and the permanent forum for people of African descent, which is more recent. So what we do as World Council of Churches is to engage with our member churches, understand the theme. So, on the one hand, we are engaging with these United Nations mechanisms to understand what is their theme. So, for example, in December, they are meeting, the working group is meeting in New York, and their focus is on reparation. So, I then engage with member churches, either those that already are having conversations on reparations in their communities. And what we do as the WCC is to bridge. So we will have a side event, but we also have facilitated one of our member churches actors to be on the working groups panel, focusing on contributions by faith communities towards reparations for people of African descent. And so we do this all the time, whether it is facilitating people coming from our member churches from the regions come to Geneva or to New York to have the platform to share what is happening in their local context. Sometimes because also we know governments don't always speak the truth. They always say the things that put them in good light. But we want also our people to come into the same spaces and say, we speak for people that are experiencing A, B, C, D in our country. And with that, sometimes it then helps the United Nations to make follow-ups, these different mechanisms to really see what is happening. So we do play this part with the focus on the United Nations. And it is our hope that regional bodies or ecumenical bodies also do the same with regional multilateral organizations, because that is one area where there is scope for advocacy. But the same can happen locally as well.
And I want to push you then on the issue of localized advocacy because, I am local grassroots person who does not have access to the top government spaces because I've not yet met Professor Dr. Masiwa Gunda. I have not yet met Angie from Indonesia, but I have been invited to speak at a graduation. I've been invited to speak on this special Sunday in church. I've been asked to lead a Bible study or to share the liturgy for next week. How can I, first of all, are there cases of racism in the Bible? And how can I be an advocate to overcome racism? Angie, how can I be an advocate to overcome issues of disability in those local spaces? So I don't know, Sarah or Gloria, if you could also spotlight Angie. And I remember in her PowerPoint, Angie actually had a few scriptures. So I will start with Masiwa and then I'm going to invite Angie to also respond. As a local player, whether or not I am a person who is negatively affected by racism? If I am a local player, not necessarily living with disability, what do I do to advocate in those spaces? Because I think that was a question that people want us to unpack a bit more. So, Masiwa, you have 3 minutes, as do you, Angie. Over to you, Masiwa.
Thank you. So quickly, let me begin by saying something against myself. As somebody coming from an academic background, we always run the risk of professionalizing everything to the exclusion of the greatest advocates of all time who never saw the door to a formal school. Advocating for and with is really about understanding the injustice that the person next to me is experiencing and choosing not to be silent in that particular instance. And this is happening in communities all over the world. It is happening at the village level, at the village square. There are those elders that have always stood up for what is right, not for who is wronged or who is accused. They have always stood with what is right. And I think we don't need to have formal training. It is important that some of us have formal training, but it is also very important for us to affirm that our mothers, wherever they are, our elders, wherever they are, have already been doing advocacy. And we can learn a lot. There are those people that we have always said, you should mind your business. You know why we say that to people? Because they advocate all the time for others. So why don't we begin to look at those people around us and begin to appreciate each time when somebody is speaking with and for the people that are often marginalized. And so at the local level, this is where the most important advocacy takes place. I think at the UN level, we are now grandstanding most of the times, but people suffer on the streets at the local level. So our advocacy at local level is identifying the funeral, the wedding, the school opening, the graduation as uh, spaces and forums through which we can have in every community. I know we have the global influencers now on social media, but every village has its own influencers. How do we bring on board these local influencers to begin to use their influence in ways that can change lives, that can impact people's experiences? Thank you.
Thank you, Masiwa. And Angie, over to you.
That is a good questions. How can we start opening the discussion of including persons with disabilities inside of church? I think the first thing that I would like to do if I were in that position is that um, realizing that where are they in our congregations? Knowing them is important. Knowing the insecurities of the communities. What are their insecurities when talking about disabilities? Are is the community afraid of giving more that they cannot that they are already giving now, or admitting that they are afraid of acknowledging that they haven't do what they're supposed to do as Christians, you know. I think knowing the roots of the issues first. Is it only about sin, or is it more than that, you know? And I think it's a good way to start the conversation. um for examples are in my country at the moment, the rate of stunt baby who is born with a stunting condition is increasing. and it increased the potential of other disabilities as well in the future, where we also lives in an environment where pollution is increasing, where climate change is happening in our coastals, and some of a lot of a church also established in remote areas, in communities where access is very very limited, and so finding ways of um, local solutions, you know uh, what can the community do to make life easier, if
Thank,
it's to make life, at least to make life easier, if advocating with the government is far outreach from our position, then making life easier for those people who live with disability, or the family who have people with disabilities living among them,
exactly.
uh, working with the community itself, working with a larger group of religious communities, because as a country who have uh, different religions at once being acknowledged by the government, we have to work with other religious communities as well to start helping the lives of these people most at risk, including persons with disabilities.
Thank you. I saw Yodia had another question. Do you want to raise that question, Yodia, even though it's one of those that we will have to answer you privately? So, Yodia, could you just ask your question, followed by Marvin Joy, and then followed by Gunilla? Yodia, can we hear from you?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. So I was just asking whether there is a way to connect with the World Council of Churches locally so that we can also be workshopped on issues of advocacy in a real systematic and strategic way instead of just working so piecemeal, scattered. So there's so many people with a passion to do something about the passion about the challenges in our areas, but
Yes,
sometimes we don't have
we're
this knowledge on how to do it strategically and to organize against it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. If I'm hearing correctly, your accent sounds South African. So, I would propose that you send us an email at communications@wcc-coe.org or information. Someone will be placing the information in the chat in a minute. And second of all, you can check with the leadership of your church, because every member church of the World Council of Churches has the right to request support from the WCC in terms of facilitating workshops and providing training. This was an exploratory foray to see whether people were interested. We had 356 registrants. 50 of you turned up, but it's a start. And we hope that coming from this, the requests for more of these will be increased. So, yes, there is scope. Was it Marvin and then Gunilla? And then I had seen a hand. So, can we make those questions very quick? And then we go to you, Reverend Delkey. Marvin?
No question from my side, Nicole. Thank you very much.
No
I
worries.
just made the comments there.
There you go. Thanks. Gunilla?
I also made a comment, but I just say in general that at least in some countries in Europe, I represent Sweden. The problem is that racism and xenophobia, we don't think we have problem with it. And we have just recently started to talk about this. And that is a big problem in our communities because they have been very homogeneous before. So this is a challenge that we have in this part.
Thank you so much. And I'm thanking you also for your honesty and your openness on this. Reverend Delkey.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Reverend Delki. I'm from Indonesia, and I'm appreciate for uh, our discussion, our what I'm say, our learning today. Yeah, so I don't have a question, but just to share about what we have done in our churches HKBP, North Sumatra, Indonesia, because in this year we have a year of inclusive, ecumenism inclusive. And then we have a challenge because I have heard from Ibu Anggi, Mrs. Anggi from Indonesia too. And yeah, we have how to, what I'm say, to starting in the local community. For example, we realized that we have many children have a disabilities, right? And the parents of the children who have a disabilities problem, they have hesitate to give the children, for example, to give to the holy baptism. So I mean that in the early of June, we have celebrating holy baptism mass and also confirmation for those who are disabilities in our churches. So and our bishop will are lead the Sunday service to the holy baptism for all the 100 children who have disabilities in North Sumatra. So that's example things that we can make from our local community about that. So I think yeah, our this is our we have many experience, especially to advocacy, especially in the grassroots level. Thank you so much, Reverend Nicole. Yeah.
Thank you, Reverend D. I would want to push to say, what did you do in terms of being together as a team to make that advocacy reality? Because I don't think you just got up one day and said, okay, today we're going to baptize. Was there a process that you went through? And you have half a minute because I see one hand up and we are closing the
Okay.
in 4 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. In our churches, we have like a place we call it Hepata. Hepata is a organization who have like an orphanage, yeah, to to collect what I'm saying to for all the children who have disabilities. And then yeah, we registered, we in the local area in North Sumatra, we ask for the all the congregation who the children has not been baptized,
Okay.
especially the our disabilities. And then they have many congregation to register in our churches, in our church in HKBP. And then in the Hepata place, we held a Sunday service special for all the disabilities who not been have baptized. Because
Okay.
our we are reality that there are many churches are hesitate to make a baptism like a normal people. So that's
Okay.
why our churches give a
Stop you
yeah
there.
give a
And
chance
it's
of that, yeah.
for Wope, Ashaye, you need to make it quick or we're gonna call it a day. So, siblings, friends, it has been an intense and worthwhile 2.5, almost 3 hours. We are in the last 2 minutes of our time. I don't
Thank you
know,
very much, Ma.
brother, you missed the opportunity. We're closing now. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you, thank you, thank you. It's
Yes.
okay.
We want to thank our colleagues, our facilitators for a very marvelous session. And so I invite Athena, Dr. Masiwa, Lani, Rasco, Padre James, if he's still awake and present, and Reverend Dr. Grace. I want to thank you all, and if you are, please just turn your screens on so that we can thank you, Angie, for your time. We had a great teaching. It was powerful, it was uplifting, it was challenging, and it was educational. If you wish to learn more, if you wish to join us for more on advocacy and how to do so, send us an email, info@wcc-coe.org. God bless you, thank you, and may God's grace and peace be with you all. Amen.